Hey, Culminators, thank you for joining us once again. Today, we're going to talk about what everybody's talking about, and I'm even going to put this recording ahead on the queue, ahead of all kinds of famous and exciting people whose interviews can wait, because this is a hot news story. It's about Ukraine. And as I was saying before we started officially recording, my guest, Irina Tsukerman, came into my mind when I was thinking to myself, after Jeremy said we should probably deal with Ukraine. It has to be topical. I always say we got to find some way to get it into the topic here. And I said to myself, well, my angle on this, I mean, I'm not any kind of international relations specialist. I last studied it in college during the Cold War. But someone who understands something about international relations, human rights issues, Russia, former Soviet Union, maybe even Ukraine, and new media. And somehow my former blogger friend, I don't think she's blogging anymore, I hardly am, Irina Tsukerman, a lawyer in Brooklyn, my old neighborhood, Brighton Beach, unless you move your office, because I see you all over the place doing all kinds of international relations things, often focusing on the Middle East. But welcome, Irina. Thank you very much on short notice for joining us and culminating, hopefully clarifying some things about what the heck is going on in Ukraine now.
Thank you so much, and thank you for inviting me.
So maybe you can give the audience a little bit of a sense of your background and why it is that you accepted this invitation, because being a level-headed professional, you're not like me, who would just be prepared to talk about anything that anyone asks them about. You're a more serious person. So explain why you do know what you're talking about.
Well, I was born in the Soviet Union, in Ukraine, in Kharkiv, which is the second largest city in Ukraine. For a brief period of time, the Soviets had made it the capital of Ukraine, but it hasn't mostly been. It was also once the capital of Ukraine's industry, in particular, the defense industry. We left Kharkiv when I was 10 in 1995. Since then, I studied in the United States, graduated from Fordham University, where I studied international relations and Middle East, actually. Then I went to Fordham Law School, and I focused on criminal and national security law, practice just run-of-the-mill legal issues in private practice for a few years, and then ended up getting involved in human rights issues first as a lawyer and also later on the media side. As a result, I got increasingly involved in geopolitical and security issues and started to specialize on information wars, on internet information warfare. A few years ago, I started getting involved with a group called CARP, basically Character Assassination and Reputational Management Program at George Mason University. It's an international gathering of experts in issues related to that area, reputational management, character assassination. It's an interdisciplinary specialty bringing together academics and practitioners from journalistic and media communications backgrounds, as well as lawyers such as myself and various other specialists in academic as well as practical studies, politics, social sciences, you name it, who've developed an integrated approach of bridging the gap between a practice of crisis management and reputational attacks in political spheres and the academic study in this area, which is only starting to emerge and become more prominent, particularly in the West. Until recently, in academic field, these studies have been relegated to the area of psychological warfare in the military academies and so forth. It's becoming a little bit more mainstream due to cancel culture, due to political scandals of various sorts. I've written a number of academic papers, but I'm also a consultant. I have my own practice. I have my own media and security consulting company called Scarab Rising. This is one of the things that we do. I also have my own online website which does podcasts as well as publishes articles called The Washington Outsider. We frequently tackle niche topics such as political scandals and intelligence related leaks and things of that nature that are not generally well covered in the media. So as a result of these combined experiences, I've developed insight into the modern information warfare as it is practiced, and I'm working to bring the academic insights that I'm learning to the field of practice to help practitioners in the field.
That's a heck of a good answer. It seems to me that we're already involved in this war, deeply involved in this war, if you consider it the information war. And in fact, it might even be argued that the United States is notwithstanding the horrors of the people that the Kharkiv are going through, is the main battlefield. Let's before we get into what's going on now, let's take a step back to 4 or 5 years. Ukraine has had an outsized role in American politics in the last half a decade, hasn't it?
Unfortunately, it has become one of those wedge issues where millions of regular people have been largely forgotten in favor of political scandals, corruption issues, and associations with the US political leadership and their internal battles.
So explain a little bit about what you mean when you say that, if you can.
We've had a number of officials in the past administrations who've been on both sides, by the way, who've been accused of corrupt links to Ukrainian companies and governments. Actually, a lot of this started with the Obama administration, who had been accused of unfair meddling in Ukrainian politics and support of the Orange Revolution there. Others claim that while his support may have been legitimate because the government at the time was extremely pro-Russian, brutal, utterly corrupt, and the people couldn't wait to get rid of it and would not have been easily able to do so without some level of assistance. The real problem came later when it became clear that Obama had been playing both sides of the aisle there, that he had allowed Russia to meddle, that some of his own ex-officials and various democratic operatives became entangled with the consequent government there, and essentially were engaged in the equivalent of war profiteering in the political sense.
Wow.
And similar charges were leveled around Trump's close circles, because some of them were also allegedly connected to some of these practices. There was an ongoing scandal regarding the firing of a prosecutor who was allegedly investigating untoward doings, but the prosecutor himself was supposedly corrupt and pro-Russian. And the biggest scandal culminating this ignoble line of political meddling and allegations involved President Biden and his family and close circles. And of course, we are seeing some of that play out in other countries as well, with China, with Hunter Biden, and all of that. Some of the people, such as Tony Podesta, who were involved in some of these scandals, are now also lobbying for China. All of that raised questions about dark money, about FARA violations. So a few people went to prison for some violations. Others never did, and Ukraine itself and its legitimate political concerns became secondary to these accusations of political corruptions and arguments whether or not Trump was being, unfair to the democratic operatives and to the government, and the other way around. President Zelensky, the relatively new president who came to power after many of these events had already transpired, was unfairly put in a position of having to deal with this political mess and facing pressure by both Democrats and Republicans. We shouldn't forget Hillary Clinton, of course. She was Tony Podesta's basically protector, and her links to this whole scandal. There are legitimate reasons for to be involved in Ukraine. It's a country filled with many natural resources, raw materials that are of interest to the United States, but none of these important geopolitical issues have been really discussed. All of it focused entirely on these on the airing of political dirty laundry, unfortunately.
Yes, and that goes right to your expertise on the issue of political character assassination, because what we saw was this phenomenal, and as an old Cold Warrior such as myself, it was mind-boggling to watch this happen, where there was this 5-year effort to associate Trump with Putin, as we say in English, as if as if anyone, it was like McCarthyism, except that there was no communism, and there was also no particular basis for it. Do you understand that there were Ukrainians, or that there was a Ukrainian element to that character assassination about Trump, the whole Putin stuff, or was that just wish casting by conservatives?
Essentially, it wasn't so much Ukraine itself as the particular companies linked to the previous, again, not to be confused with the current government, previous administration and the Poroshenko government, which was fairly aligned with the United States, but also fairly corrupt, and where Trump was considered, pro-Trump circles were, for whatever reason, considered closer and sympathetic to Russia. Unfortunately, people tend to stereotype and put in very, very diverse political operatives in kind of the same box. There were people like Steve Bannon and that whole crew that no doubt had their share of comments sympathetic to Russia's government, but most others saw Putin for who he was, and the Trump administration levied sanctions against Nord Stream. They were fairly tough on Russia, even if President Trump's own commentary did not always reflect that. So we're talking about actions, not just words and that sort of craziness. Ukraine, there were a number, as I said, of officials affiliated with the Democrats, particularly the Hillary Clinton camp, who were linked to corrupt Burisma related affairs, some as lobbyists, some as board members. Some of the board members were arguably not qualified or linked to be in that position, and all of that was used to try to claim that to show that the Democrats attacking Trump were hypocrites. They were attacking Trump while covering up their own dirty business and their corruption. Unfortunately, again, as an unintended consequence of that political battle, Ukraine was used to make it seem like the entire Ukrainian government was complicit and that there was some political arrangement, some quid pro quo of covering of Ukraine government meddling in U.S. affairs. The reality is Hillary Clinton's camp did try to use various political angles to go after Trump, many of the Ukrainian lobbyists were in fact closer to the Democrats for obvious reasons, but there was no equivalent meddling by Ukraine itself in US political affairs as by Russia's President Putin and his troll factories. It's not an equivalent.
Okay. So you just came on to my next point. and I'm going to pair it with a point that will bring us up to 2022. The Russian troll factories, the Russian bots. We were sold this bill of goods that might have had a lot of truth to it, which was that there was this tremendous psychological psyop that had been rolled out of the Kremlin, whereby American public opinion was to be manipulated through social media. And Facebook, as much as said that they detected this and that they actually didn't do enough to stop it. And supposedly this influence, this brilliant manipulation of social media was so profound that it actually affected the 2016 election. Now we're in 2022, and there's all this moral ambiguity out there for anyone who actually will make some kind of effort not to see the world in black and white terms, which is almost nobody on Twitter, I agree. But the Russians, and Putin in particular, are taking a shellacking. They're getting killed. If they have power to manipulate social media, what would it be like if they didn't have that power? Alternatively, maybe they don't have that power at all. It seems to me that whatever grievances or rationalizations Putin might have for what he's doing, he and the Russian government have failed miserably at having any kind of effect on Western opinion about the legitimacy of what they're doing. Is it just because what they're doing is just so bad that there's no getting around it? Because if it was China, I don't think I think he'd be a much easier sell, because he'd have the whole NBA they'd have the whole NBA on their side. Tell me, what do you think about my juxtaposition? Why is Putin so failing in the public relations war?
Well, China is arguably far more powerful and far more well-positioned geopolitically actor than Russia. It has far more influence, and its economy is far more integrated with the United States and that of other Western countries, but definitely the US. California is heavily dependent on China, and there is a great deal of conflict of interest, just financially, not to mention politically. Russia has a tiny GDP. It's actually less than that of the average income is a fraction of an average income from in Texas, and its GDP is actually smaller than Texas. So it's not a big economy. It's easy to isolate. It's not heavily dependent on the financial. It's not heavily integrated in the financial institutions in the US, and simply doesn't do a lot of the activity. And the population is also a fraction of China's, even though it's a pretty big population. It's not a small country at all, population-wise. That said, I wouldn't say that Putin has failed completely. He had overreached, arguably, in recent months. The invasion of Ukraine in that particular form had been obviously a significant miscalculation. He just went too far, but he was able to get away with everything else up until that point. And had he not been so brazen about it, maybe he would have gotten away with that as well, as he had gotten away with the invasions of Georgia, Moldova, his annexation of Crimea, and his brutal actions in Syria, not to mention his own repression of the Russian population, and assorted criminal activity, attempted assassinations of former agents around the world, assassination of the opposition inside the country, and so many other things. As far as the manipulation of public opinion, you're correct. The troll factors were not enough, clearly not enough to sway the public in favor of any specific candidate. The effect the cumulative Russian active measures did have, however, is to create a more sympathetic image of Putin himself inside both Democrat and conservative camps. Specifically, I would say, again, the Steve Bannon hardcore followers, not all conservatives, certainly. Not everybody was fooled by his fake defender of conservative or Christian values agenda. Most people see him for the KGB thug that he is, who has been not did not respect religions, and quite frankly sided with Islamists and used them, whether with Iran or the Chechen Islamists or others, whenever it suited his purposes. A completely cynical, corrupt character who is essentially thrives on using polarizations, divisions, skepticism uh, to uh, to plant conspiracy theories and to feed off these divisions and manipulate opinion based on them. He's infiltrated BLM, so he did not just go for the conservatives. He also similarly manipulated the public opinion on the Democrat side on social issues in the United States. None of these methods are new, by the way. They all harken back to the Soviet KGB KGB operations, and KGB was particularly good at these operations simply because, as a poor country, the Soviet Union was not really capable of competing with the Western countries economically, the way China, for instance, can, even though China also suffers from all sorts of economic issues, but at the very least, it's a much larger state and they've invested intelligently. The Soviet Union did not invest in countries, they invested not even in spying so much as in planting conspiracy theories. And we are seeing the same methods work today with climate change, with racial divisions, racial cards, and of course with glorifying Putin and portraying him as some sort of a response to a woke culture, which by the way was also planted by the Russians and by the Soviet Union and exploited.
So there's a lot going on here, and you're illuminating a lot. And I spoke with James Lindsay last year in this podcast, and he explained about how once the Communist Party realized that economics would never be a successful wedge issue in the United States, that they identified racial strife as the wedge issue that would and could work, and academia as the ideal place to focus on fomenting a Marxist approach to race relations in the United States, which is exactly what BLM as well as critical race theory enunciate. And your incredibly important point here is that Putin plays both sides. I mean, it's the old KGB model of basically trying to undermine institutions in the United, in the rival countries, rather than just competing, because it's easier to destroy than to build. As you pointed out at the beginning of our interview, though, of course, the United States has its own history of undermining, whether officially or unofficially, through the corrupt political culture. What it certainly, we were talking about Ukraine. I don't know how much of that there has been with respect to the Putin regime. But one thing I was on a show yesterday, and we were talking about what was Putin's goal here, and I said, I don't think there was necessarily a well-defined goal. It was an opportunity to take advantage of an obvious power vacuum, because the Obama foreign policy thrust, which is, and this is Obama's third term, is to actually create power vacuums where the United States once had influence or hegemony, which is it's extraordinary. I mean, it's literally a definition of subversion, and to just exploit it. In other words, whatever is bad for America is good for Putin's Russia, because it gives him more options, it gives him more flexibility, it gives him more wealth, because he's one of the, if not the richest man in the world, he's one of the richest men in the world. He gets a percentage of everything that happens in Russia. what do you think? In other words, my guess was he thought this would go very quickly and very easily, notwithstanding that almost every Russian or Soviet leader who has ever attacked a smaller country has made the mistake of thinking that and been wrong. Japan, Finland, the Russians don't actually tend to win these things, or they win them at an incredibly outsized cost. But they underestimate, they despise their enemies. They make strategic mistakes based on underappreciation of how hard people will fight for their own territory, notwithstanding the World War II experience of the Soviet Union. And he thought it would be a week in and out. He would get a certain amount of territory and maybe access to, more warm water ports. My geostrategy is not so strong. That's a very long way of asking you, Irina, what do you think the goal was a month ago?
Putin's goal the entire time has been one and the same, which is to reunite former portions of the Russian Empire. He would have preferred to do so peacefully. By peaceful, I mean by getting rid of the government and skipping the war. That was not his first attempt. The Western media did not cover it, but a couple months back, there was an attempted coup in Ukraine that was reported by the official sources, but it never went anywhere in the US media or any media for that matter, which to me was shocking. That was a clear indication of an external actor's involvement, quite possibly, and that question was never raised. Oh, there was an internal coup, and who cares? And but to me, this was a clear red flag. And sure enough, when that failed, we saw that Putin then went the direction of outright aggression. I've recently written an article why Putin thought he could get away with that, and the reason was very simple. He knew that Biden, first of all, showed signs of weakness in Afghanistan and everywhere around the world, but more importantly, he was obsessed with the Iran deal, with achieving Iran deal to the exclusion of every other priority. And he needed Russia's and China's help because Iran has been playing its games for over a year with no signs of budging, despite all the unilateral concessions that the administration has made. Russia essentially has been dictating its terms in Iran. Russia and Iran, going back to the days of Soviet Union, had a very complicated relationship where the Soviet government was essentially instructing the post-Islamic revolutionary regime, but there was no love lost. Iran and Russia have always been geopolitical competitors, rivals. On the people-to-people level, they don't get along very well. But the government benefited from the Soviet involvement tremendously, even though the line going back to the 80s was neither east nor west. It's not strictly speaking true. Some of the current regime apparatchiks were rumored to have been Soviet agents at the time. And following the dissolution of the Soviet Union, Iran continued that relationship, and Russia actually, on some issues, has come out on top. In recent years, we can see the Caspian Sea divisions where Russia managed to outplay Iran. And so, in terms of the current negotiations in Vienna, Russia has been playing a top-level role. It has been dictating its terms to both Iran and to the United States and European countries involved in these talks. And it was natural that Biden would think of trying to use Russia to get Iran to sign off on something, however symbolic, just to save his image before his own base and have some major political accomplishment before the midterms. Now, we are seeing how that's playing out at a huge cost. We're hearing all sorts of scandalous allegations about the terms of the deal that Rob Malley is pushing. But I find it entirely plausible to think that Biden could have chosen to close his eyes towards Russia's ambitions in Ukraine. I think both of them were expecting this to be a very short affair, to end quickly, for Zelensky to flee at first signs of danger, and for the country to peacefully collapse and be taken over, some pro-Russian government to be put in place with minimal casualties, and that was a huge mistake on everyone's part.
So let's talk about Zelensky. He is a fascinating character. He seems to be very media savvy. He's young. He's good looking. He's been caught, or his supporters have been caught in some misinformation, sending around pictures of him in fatigues and whatnot that have nothing to do with this conflict, that are a couple of years old or whatever. But do you think he's playing his cards right in terms of the information war?
I think he's doing a tremendous job. First of all, people tend to underestimate him because they think, oh, it's some comedian, actor, clown. First of all, the guy is a civil engineer, education-wise. He's not someone uneducated or stupid. Second, we forget about President Reagan, who was a B-movie actor and became one of the US greatest presidents. So that is silly, and these boosting of the president's image during the war with some pictures, it's mild. It doesn't, harm anybody. It's pretty just standard sort of thing that you can expect from anybody in that situation. Much more interesting is the victories Ukraine as a country has been scoring on that front. Rather than engaging in counter trolling on social media and trying to recreate Russia's own information warfare strategy with the disinformation, they've been doing exactly the opposite. They've been actually fighting disinformation in a very effective way. For instance, by putting up websites and hotlines to inform Russian families about their sons who are missing in action or have been captured or killed or injured in the battlefield. Something that Putin has been trying to cover up, to the point that up until recently he claimed there were zero people killed, which is not even plausible. But consider that even many of the soldiers themselves were disinformed about where they were going. It's unfortunately is panning out as true, and we should remember that Putin did the same thing in Crimea and was never called out for it. He covered up the deaths of the soldiers and made all sorts of justifications. The families were later, some of them were quietly restituted for the deaths, but we're told to keep their mouths shut. So
the fact that can even happen, I think it brings up an important point that I've tried to make a couple of times, which is that Putin is a strong man. He's an authoritarian. He is a gangster, but he's not Stalin. He cannot control information, and he doesn't have an absolute clamp on political power and dissent the way Stalin did. People think, well, he can do whatever he wants and there's no downside to it. And they don't even necessarily appreciate that the Afghanistan war, which was still during the Soviet period, had a destructive effect on the Soviet regime, which was not Stalinist, but which still far more authoritarian in terms of information management. I mean, the fact that people can even get access to such websites or such hotlines in Russia today tells you that it's not that kind of dictatorship.
I disagree, because having sophisticated skills in gaining access to information and the fact that it's very difficult to close, short of shutting down the internet completely, doesn't mean that he's not aspiring to do that. He shut off two of the main outlets focused on alternative discourse, shall we say, the Echo of Moscow and Rain. Just the other day, for the last few years, Rain in particular had been relegated to a basement, subterranean existence. It was popular among the cultural elites, but those are relatively small in number. And quite frankly, I think Putin discovered that disinformation and manipulation of information work much better than cutting off the information completely and creating the forbidden fruit effect that we have seen during the Soviet era, when more people flocked to read Western literature and some is that, and listening to US stations, the Voice of America and so forth, Radio Free Europe or whatever, then had they probably opened it up, but filled it with their own propaganda. So there is apparently still a lot of support based on disinformation for what Putin is doing. He has been using his ministry to quote unquote educate and enlighten the people about the necessity of liberating Ukraine. He has been for decades propagating that Ukraine is responsible for war crimes against ethnic Russians, and he has just been manipulating even the results on the internet and propagating this image that that US hates Russia, that US is looking for an opportunity to attack and victimize Russia in whatever ways that it can, and that Ukraine is, an enemy and so forth. Whereas the countries are very close. There are many Ukrainians living in Russia and vice versa. These are two people who are constantly intermarrying. Literally, there are many families of mixed backgrounds. So this is kind of insane. But it's not.
I saw a fascinating map last night. Maybe I can pull it up during the next moment or so, where someone demonstrate. We have this tendency to want to see things in black and white terms.
Mhm.
Ukraine good, Russia bad, and in fact, there is no Ukraine that is truly not that is black to Russia's white. Russia and Ukraine have been connected and mixed together, well, forever, and certainly for everyone's lifetime who's alive now. And there are also there are different groups. There are different ethnic groups and cultural divisions within Ukraine, some of whom are much more Russia friendly than others. Correct?
Yeah, I would say so. I would say that, but we have to remember, from culturally, I would say absolutely, even linguistically, but from a political perspective, it is no longer the case. We have seen that President Zelensky, who is very anti-Putin specifically, has been elected by 73% of the country, including in those pro-Russian areas, which just tells you that while they maybe have some cultural affinity for the Russian language and culture, they do not want to be part of Russia, nor most of them are looking to move there or have tried to do so, even when under less, successful administrations pre-existing to that. Russia is not a model of, economic prosperity that anyone would necessarily abandon their own homeland for, and their heavy-handed methods are a turn off even for people who would normally be more sympathetic to some of these cultural arguments.
Irina, you have been tremendously informative, and I like the fact that you have schooled me a couple times in the last few questions, and that's how we learn. I really appreciate it. And what do you think? What do you think happens next? Is there any way before we end? Is there any way for Putin to get out of this?
To get out of this alive, you mean?
I imagine that he's going to live a long time. But in other words, this isn't what he was hoping for. He's getting hemmed in. He's taken gigantic steps backwards in terms of relations. He's going to have to depend more on China now, which is also never more than an arm's length.
China is not Russia's friend. They've become codependent on each other in terms of political support and legitimacy. But China has played this whole thing very cleverly. It showed early support, open support, for encouraging Putin to take steps of aggression. But once the invasion was actually done, it backed off. It did not openly support Putin, probably realizing that it is now in an advantageous position and that Putin will need China to bail him out. Now, how can he really bail them out? so far, Russia does have significant military superiority to Ukrainians, even with all the new Stingers and Javelins and the fighting spirit and so forth. And the fact that Russia has not used its air force to the optimal degree for a variety of reasons. Nevertheless, they simply have more planes and they simply have more power, and there's simply a lot of, it's a big concentration of fighters. That doesn't mean that they will be able to hold their power for a very long time. It's very unlikely, actually, but so far, the chances are they'll be able to acquire and take by force at least some of the territory in Ukraine before Ukraine manages to liberate itself sooner or later. And all sorts of things can happen that we're currently not predicting. Nobody was predicting that the West would suddenly de-swift. Russia certainly was not, no one was predicting that Japan would actually join the West in de-swifting Russia. No one was predicting the sort of debate that became quite heated, the level of outrage, and the fact that increasingly there is pressure on Biden to sanction the energy sector, which would absolutely undermine everything Putin is doing. But until all of that happens, Putin does have some leverage to play around, and so far as he appears to be victorious, he can still salvage his image and appear to be, even though his image has been weakened by his inability to bring Ukraine down quickly, so far as he appears to be holding on to some territory there, he can still sell that image of a strong leader to his own base and to the FSB security people, the oligarchs, and so forth. So far, he has been relegated to having to rule exclusively through fear. That is not a good position to be in. People think that being a dictator is great. It's not. If you do not have any level of popular support, you become increasingly isolated, paranoid, and you end up being backed into a corner from which there is no getting out. So unless Putin figures out how to handle his own population, no matter what happens in Ukraine down the road politically, he will not meet a good end sooner or later. How long that will take, no one knows. That will have to involve Ukraine receiving some form of additional assistance from somebody in some capacity. They simply have to change their military calculus in some way, whether by producing their own weapons, acquiring them from somewhere, getting some assistance, getting more mercenaries, who knows. But something has got to change. Either Russia has to crack on one end, and people need to start surrendering even more so than they've already been doing, or Ukraine has to increase its own capabilities, or some combination of both. But Putin thinks he can still make it, and it's not completely unreasonable for him to think about that, at least in the short term, because Ukraine is under tremendous stress, and the West has not been as helpful as it could be. NATO has been very hands-off, even going back on its promise to deliver fighter jets that Ukraine desperately needs. It remains to be seen whether they can get them from somewhere else, whether this dynamic will change with time, and whether the West will continue to try to apply the sanctions. So far, they have not been applied fully. Major banks have been exempted. Russia has been able to look to the Arab world and to China, and in terms of financial backup to this situation, with the banks being under sanctions and the run on the banks and the currency crisis. But down the road, I don't think Putin has a political future. I think at this point it's desperation based on that one big miscalculation, thinking that he could take the country easily and hold it. That was not going to happen, and he completely misjudged Zelensky and his intentions.
Well, you just said something that you alluded to a couple of minutes ago, which was that you have questions about Putin's own political future. All right, so that's something we would never have said about Stalin, right? They were afraid to call a doctor when he was dying of a stroke, because they thought if he recovered, he would punish whoever it was who saw him desperately on the floor. what could happen to Putin in Russia? What's the scenario where he could lose power?
Well, Stalin, that's the funny thing about Stalin. People claim it was a stroke, but there's a very good chance that the stroke was induced by artificial means. In other words, that he was poisoned.
Yes, it was probably by Beria.
Putin could very well meet the same end. Alternatively, he could simply be forced out of power and just, forced to resign or else. So far, he has been able to prevail by an image of fear. We have seen him humiliating the head of his external intelligence publicly on air. But we are not sure whether the military apparatus that so far has proven to be relatively weak and corrupt, by the way, will ultimately take that for long. He has also angered a lot of the oligarchs who lost a lot as a result of all this, and he does not seem to have a plan how to recover that money. There's no backup plan for Russia on how to get out of the sanctions. So while they may be able to hold on to Ukraine for some period of time to gain full benefit of Ukraine's natural resources, that's not likely going to happen so long as Russia itself is under sanctions for the same reasons. Immediately, these markets of gas and so forth, they will likely be sanctioned to some capacity. Yes, so far Europe is still buying energy, but we have seen an unusual shift. Germany specifically came out and claimed that it wants to buy gas from the United States. It's unclear how that's going to happen given Biden's own position, but Biden may lose power in 2 years and may lose significant leverage this year if Congress flips. So a lot of things are already going on for Putin. Even in the most optimal scenario that he is able to take Kiev, get rid of Zelensky by force, install his own people, that government is not going to be seen as legitimate. It will face the same level of sanctions from the same countries as Russia itself. It's not going to be a huge advantage, and it's not going to make up for it. And Iran is also not a full solution, and China itself is not a reliable ally in the sense that China sees Russia as an inferior junior partner that it needs just to have somebody voting with you at the UN and international institutions, but does not need economically. China is looking to take over portions of Russia and has been doing so naturally, peacefully, because Russia is unable to control those lands economically. They are underdeveloped, empty, and abandoned, essentially. So China has a lot of leverage over Russia. I think at the end of the day, the best case scenario for Putin, he will end up being as a semi-puppet of China and doing China's bidding. And that's probably the best he can hope for. And in the worst case scenario, he'll either be killed or forced to abdicate and, live a life of humility with his billions and his billions in ill-begotten wealth. But I don't see a very positive outcome. He just overplayed his hand and alienated too many people.
Irina, fantastic analysis. Thank you so much for coming on. I hope we do this again soon.
Thank you so much. It was an honor and a pleasure.
Same here.